Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're going exploring some pretty thought-provoking stuff.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
We'll be looking at how the media operates in a world. Well, let's be honest. A world that is absolutely dominated by corporate interests.
Interesting.
Our guide for this, Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
It's a classic for a reason, and it raises some really, really important questions. Questions that we still grapple with even today, like how much control do we actually have over the information we consume, you know?
That's a big one, for
Yeah.
sure. And it's one that this book really tackles head on. It's amazing how, even though it was published way back in 1988,
1988, wow.
Chomsky and Herman's, what they call the propaganda model,
A propaganda model.
yeah, still feels so relevant today.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
okay, yeah, so what is this propaganda model exactly? It sounds a little intense. I don't know.
It is intense, but it's also, like, super insightful. Basically, they propose these five filters that they argue influence, well, they really influence what news we see and how we see it.
Right.
And the very first one is, ownership. Just the reality that most, well, really most major media outlets are owned by these huge corporations.
Right.
You know,
So, I mean, right off the bat, there's a potential conflict of interest there, right?
Right.
Like corporations, at the end of the day, they're driven by profit, not necessarily by some, like mission to inform the public or anything like that.
precisely. Yeah. And it's not about, like, some evil mastermind dictating every single headline. It's more like a system where, where profit motives just kind of subtly influence editorial decisions.
Right.
And then we add the second filter into the mix, which is, advertising.
Advertising, yeah.
This is a big one. Because the media, they rely so heavily on ad revenue.
Of course. Yeah.
Meaning they can't really afford to, alienate their sponsors.
Makes sense. Yeah. I mean, it's less about like direct censorship, I guess, and more about, I don't know, not biting the hand that feeds you.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, have you ever seen a major network run like a big expose on a company that is also one of their biggest sponsors?
Never.
No, exactly. It's subtle, but it's so powerful.
It's powerful, yeah.
So we've got ownership, advertising. What's number 3?
Number 3 is sourcing. So this one digs into, like, where media actually gets its information from.
Okay.
And Chomsky and Herman, they argue that, for cost and convenience, there's this heavy reliance on government and corporate sources.
Makes sense. I mean, they've got the resources, right? They've got the people.
Exactly.
So, I mean, basically those sources they kind of get priority access, right? They really shape what even makes it into the news cycle.
And not just access, but they're also, a lot of times, they're seen as, more credible. Like, it's just easier for a journalist to quote, I don't know, like some official statement,
Right.
than to do, like, really deep investigative work.
Right.
Which obviously takes way more time and resources.
Yeah. Starting to feel like a bit of a, like, closed loop here. Like, it all just feeds back into itself.
It does, yeah. And then you add, flak, the fourth filter.
Flak. What's flak?
So this is all about the negative responses.
Yeah.
The negative responses to media content.
Okay.
So we're talking angry letters, lawsuits, boycotts.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Things that can cost a media outlet money.
Of course. Damage their reputation.
Yeah, and damage their reputation, exactly. So it's understandable, right, that they try to avoid triggering that kind of that kind of backlash.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that lead to self-censorship then? Like, do they avoid stories that they think might cause that kind of pushback?
Yeah, that's the argument. And to top it all off, we have the fifth filter,
Okay, the fifth one.
which Chomsky and Herman originally called anti-communism.
Anti-communism. Okay.
But more broadly, it's really about exploiting public fear
Fair.
of anything, really.
Yeah. So it's like create an us versus them narrative, and suddenly people are like way more willing to accept policies or actions that they might otherwise question.
Exactly.
Yeah. I guess the enemy, the them can change with the times, but the tactic stays the same.
The tactic stays the same, exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got these 5 filters, right? Ownership, advertising, sourcing, flak, and fear.
Okay, 5 filters. Got it.
But how do they actually play out in the real world? You know what I mean? Like, how do they really work? Well, one way is through this concept of worthy versus unworthy victim.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. What do they mean by that? Worthy versus unworthy victims.
So Chomsky and Herman argue that media, they tend to give way more attention and way more sympathy to victims who serve some kind of political purpose.
Oh, I see.
You know what I mean?
Like their story fits a narrative that's already kind of been decided on.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this can be a really stark contrast when you compare how certain events are covered.
Okay, I need an example. Help me wrap my head around this.
Okay, sure. Take the Soviet downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007
Okay.
back in 1983.
Yeah.
This is huge news, covered extensively, and it was used to really bolster U.S. policy against the Soviets during the Cold War.
Yeah. I remember learning about that in history class. It was a really big deal.
Right. Now contrast that with the downing of a Libyan civilian airliner by Israeli jets in 1973.
Okay, yeah.
Far less coverage, quickly dismissed as just an accident. But both incidents, they involved this tragic loss of life, right?
Not horrors, yeah.
But the media treatment was just vastly different.
Yeah. Wow. Why? Just because one involved the Soviets during the Cold War.
That's basically the point Chomsky and Herman are making.
I mean, it feels kind of arbitrary. Like, like who's suffering matters more.
Yeah. The Soviet incident fit this narrative, the narrative of the evil empire.
Right.
And it was useful for pushing certain policies.
Right, okay.
The Israeli incident, well, it just wasn't as it wasn't as useful in that way.
You see. So certain victims become these like big, important stories while other are practically ignored.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Wow. Are there other examples of this? Like are there other examples of this kind of thing?
Oh, tons. The book really meticulously documents cases where totally different standards were applied depending on whether a country was, U.S. supported or opposed.
Yeah, okay, so it's like two totally different lenses to look at the same event through.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow, so it's not just individual incidents, but the overall narrative too, right? Like are there whole conflicts that have been distorted because of these filters?
That's right. Chomsky and Herman, they analyze how these filters shaped how they shaped the coverage of the Vietnam War, the secret war in Laos, and the Cambodian genocide. They argue that the media, they often presented, this kind of simplified and misleading narrative, one that really served U.S. interests.
Okay, so what do they say about Vietnam specifically?
Well, they argue that it was portrayed as like a fight against external aggression.
Right.
And they say that the media downplayed U.S. atrocities and the devastation of Vietnamese society.
Yeah.
And the suffering of the Vietnamese people was largely ignored.
And then there's Laos, which honestly, I don't know that much about the secret war there. What happened?
So it involved this devastating U.S. bombing campaign.
Okay.
But it got very little attention in the U.S. media at the time.
Wow. And what about Cambodia?
So the focus there was primarily on the Khmer Rouge atrocities.
Right.
While the role of U.S. bombing and creating the conditions that actually led to their rise to power was downplayed.
So in each of these cases, there's this deliberate shaping of the narrative to serve a specific agenda. Are they saying that journalists are straight up spreading propaganda?
Not necessarily. What they're pointing to is a system that encourages certain types of coverage and really discourages others. So it's systemic bias, not individual malice.
Okay. But if these filters are, if they're so pervasive, what can we do about it? Are we just doomed to be manipulated by the media?
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Chomsky and Herman's point isn't to make us feel powerless. It's to empower us to be more critical media consumers.
Yeah.
They're giving us this a framework for analyzing media coverage, like a set of tools for dissecting all this information that we're bombarded with daily.
So it's like they're giving us a decoder ring for the news.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Uh-huh.
It's about understanding the underlying forces that influence media content. So when you see a news report, you can ask yourself, okay, who owns this outlet? Who are their advertisers?
Right.
Where are they getting their information from?
Yeah.
What kind of flak might they be trying to avoid? And what fears are they tapping into?
So it's not about rejecting everything we read or hear. It's about approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right.
Is that what they mean by media literacy?
Exactly. It's recognizing that media, it's not this neutral mirror reflecting reality.
Yeah.
It's a constructed product. It reflects the interests of the people who create it and control it.
Wow, so it's even more complex than just those 5 filters, huh?
It is.
The book also talks about these specific tactics that are used by, say, corporations to shape public perception, right?
Yes. Chomsky and Herman discuss how powerful entities like corporations and governments, they employ these really sophisticated strategies to manage the news.
Okay.
One example is the influence of public relations firms, who often act as these intermediaries between powerful actors and the media.
Interesting. So they're basically crafting the narrative before it even gets to a journalist.
Yeah, they're creating this prepackaged story ready for media consumption, and often that becomes the dominant narrative.
Can you give me an example of how that works in practice?
Well, they discuss how the chemical industry has used PR to downplay the risks of harmful products.
Okay.
But instead of focusing on specific products, let's just focus on the tactic itself,
Okay.
which is delay and deny.
Delay and deny.
So downplaying the risks until overwhelming evidence forces their hand.
That's a disturbing thought, delaying action, potentially putting public health at risk just to protect profits.
Absolutely. And how do we hold powerful industries accountable for the safety of their products?
Right.
The book also highlights how the precautionary principle is often ignored in these cases.
What's the precautionary principle?
It basically states that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of harm, even without scientific consensus, the burden of proof that it's not harmful falls on those taking the action.
So err on the side of caution.
You could say that.
That seems to make sense. Like, why would anyone not want to follow that?
Powerful industries often resist it. They argue it stifles innovation and economic growth.
Okay.
They prefer to wait for conclusive evidence of harm before taking action, even if that means potentially exposing the public to risk.
So are they suggesting that it's like playing Russian roulette with public health? Because that's kind of what it sounds like.
That's a pretty stark but accurate analogy,
Yeah.
and they give examples of how this has led to serious consequences. Genetically modified foods are one example.
Right. There's a lot of debate about the potential risks of GMOs. Some people worry about unintended consequences for human health or the environment.
And the book argues that media has often downplayed these concerns, focusing instead on the potential benefits of GMOs, like increased crop yields.
So it all comes back to framing, right? How an issue is presented can have a huge impact on how the public perceives it.
Exactly. Chomsky and Herman argue that media often frames issues in a way that favors powerful interests.
It feels like we're going in circles. If they control the framing, downplay risks, and manipulate narratives, how do we ever break free from these dominant narratives?
It's not easy. The first step is awareness. Understanding how these filters operate helps us to start to see through the propaganda.
So we need to become more discerning consumers of media. What else can we do?
We can seek out alternative sources of information, ones that aren't beholden to corporate interests.
Right, so independent media support them by subscribing, donating, sharing their work. Help amplify those voices. But what about this idea that Chomsky and Herman bring up, that the whole structure of the media system undermines democracy? Isn't that a bit extreme?
They're not saying democracy is impossible, but that the focus on profit and reliance on advertising revenue creates this inherent bias towards the status quo.
Because challenging powerful interests or presenting radical alternatives won't get you many advertisers or please corporate owners. It's like you're only allowed to critique within a very narrow, acceptable range.
Exactly. They argue that this system creates this limited range of acceptable debate that excludes voices that challenge the fundamental premises of the system. So instead of a robust and diverse public sphere, we get this carefully curated media landscape that just reinforces existing power structures.
That's a pretty depressing thought. It makes you wonder if genuine democratic participation is even possible within this system.
That's the question they pose. If these filters are so deeply embedded in our media, how can we create a media system that is truly free and independent?
It is a big question, yeah, and honestly kind of a scary one. Like, where do we even begin to tackle something like that,
Yeah.
you know? How do we ensure that the information we're getting, that we're receiving, is accurate, is balanced, and actually reflects like the diverse perspectives of our society?
Well, I think it starts with each of us as individuals.
Okay.
You know, how can we become more conscious, more critical consumers of this incredibly powerful force? And I think a good place to start is just acknowledging that we all come to the table with our own preconceived notions,
Right.
our own biases.
I mean, I guess we can't really escape that, can we? Like, everyone Everyone has biases. It's part of being human.
Exactly. And these biases, well, they can really influence how we interpret information.
Yeah.
So I mean, so we need to be aware of our own biases and
Yeah.
really actively challenge them.
So like ask ourselves, am I only seeking out information that confirms my existing beliefs? Or am I immediately dismissing anything that challenges my worldview? You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Being a critical consumer of media means being open to new perspectives. Even those we might initially disagree with, it means being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
So it's not just about what we consume, but how we consume it.
Yeah.
Like actively engaging with it, not just passively absorbing it, right?
Right.
What about seeking out like a wider range of sources? Does that help?
Absolutely. Yeah. Diversifying our media diet is so crucial. Don't just rely on a single source for information.
Right.
Seek out multiple perspectives.
So like read news from different countries,
Mm.
listen to podcasts from a variety of viewpoints.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It's like getting the whole picture instead of just one angle.
Exactly. Yeah. The more diverse our media consumption, the more well-rounded our understanding of the world will be.
But then there's all that stuff about like deliberate manipulation too.
Right.
Like propaganda and those sorts of tactics. How do we spot that? I feel like that would be pretty hard to recognize if it's done well.
It can be subtle.
Mhm.
Propaganda, well, it often relies on emotional appeals
Okay.
rather than logic or reason.
Okay.
It uses loaded language and imagery,
Yeah.
to evoke very specific feelings and reactions.
So less about like facts and figures and more about just getting you like riled up.
Exactly. Yeah. And it often simplifies complex issues, presenting them in these black and white terms. But by understanding these techniques, we can become more resistant to their influence.
So it's like being able to see the strings being pulled, right? Like you said
Mhm.
before.
Right.
What about supporting independent media outlets? Is that part of the solution here?
I think it's a big part of the solution. These outlets, well, they're often less beholden to corporate interests, and they're more likely to produce investigative journalism that challenges the status quo.
Right. Okay. So like subscribing to independent newspapers, donating to nonprofit news organizations, sharing their content online. Those are all ways to help, right?
Absolutely, yeah. A healthy democracy, it requires a vibrant and independent media.
Hmm.
We need to create a media ecosystem that is diverse, that is accountable, and that truly serves the public interest.
And of course, I mean, we can't ignore the internet.
Right.
Like it's changed everything about how we get our news and how we get information.
Yeah, it really has. It's
Yeah.
created new opportunities for citizen journalism,
Mhm.
for alternative media, which is great.
Oh, right.
But they're also new challenges.
Like misinformation and those echo chambers everyone's always talking about.
Exactly.
Mm.
While the internet has this incredible potential to democratize media, it also has the potential to really exacerbate existing problems.
Right.
So navigating this digital landscape, well, it requires even greater critical thinking skills and media literacy.
So like double down on that fact checking and be wary of algorithms that are pushing us into like those filter bubbles where we only see stuff that confirms what we already believe.
Yeah, actively seek out diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
Challenge your own filter bubble.
Right?
I mean,
Yeah.
this is an ongoing process. It's about constantly questioning, evaluating, and seeking out new information.
And ultimately, I guess it's about demanding a media system that truly serves the public.
Yeah.
Not just the powerful.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
And the opportunity.
Well, listener, there you have it. A deep dive into the sometimes murky, sometimes very murky world of media and power. I hope this journey has been as eye-opening and thought-provoking for you as it has been for us.
Remember, questioning the narratives we're presented with, that's the first step. The first step towards creating a more informed and a more empowered citizenry.
So keep those critical thinking caps on.
Yeah.
Keep exploring. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.